Luke Carter leaned against the wooden fence that bordered his farm, his eyes scanning the parched fields in front of him. The once lush, green pastures that had fed his family for generations were now cracked and barren, the soil crumbling to dust beneath the merciless sun. It hadn't rained in months, and every day the drought dragged on felt like another nail in the coffin of his farm and the town. Nestled in the heart of Johnson County, the small town of Maplewood had long relied on the surrounding farmland for its livelihood. Luke's farm, Carter Acres, was one of the oldest in the area, a testament to the resilience of the Carter family. His father had run it before him, and his grandfather before that. But now, as Luke stared at the dry, lifeless fields, he wondered if he'd be the one to let it all slip away. A sudden rumble of engines broke his train of thought. Turning, Luke saw a convoy of trucks kicking up clouds of dust as they rolled past his property. The green and white logo of Green Horizons Incorporated was plastered on the side of each vehicle, a symbol that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. Luke tightened his grip on the fence. Green Horizons, a massive agribusiness corporation, had bought up large tracts of land on the outskirts of Maplewood earlier that year. At first, they had promised jobs and economic growth, touting plans for state-of-the-art farming operations. But it wasn't long before the truth came out. Their plans involved diverting Maplewood's only reliable water source, Willow Creek, to irrigate their industrial farms. It was a death sentence for small farmers like Luke, who relied on the creek for irrigation. Without it, the town wouldn't survive. "They've got no right," Luke muttered to himself, clenching his jaw. That evening, Luke sat in the back of the crowded town hall, his arms crossed as he listened to a representative from Green Horizons deliver a slick presentation. The man, dressed in a crisp suit and wearing an air of corporate confidence, pointed to colorful slides showing charts, graphs, and projections. "Our irrigation project will not only bring advanced agricultural technology to Johnson County," the man said, his voice smooth and polished, "but it will create hundreds of jobs and stimulate the local economy." A smattering of applause filled the room, but Luke remained silent. He could see through the sales pitch. The jobs might come, but at what cost? When the presentation ended, the town mayor, an aging man named Harold Jenkins, opened the floor for public comments. Luke shot to his feet before anyone else could speak. "Jobs and growth?" Luke said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "What about the farmers who are already here? What about the people who've worked this land their whole lives? What happens to us when you take the water we depend on?" The room fell quiet, all eyes on Luke. The Green Horizons representative gave a practiced smile. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns," he said, his tone patronizing. "But our studies show that the creek's flow is sufficient to meet the needs of both our operation and the local community. There's no need for alarm." Luke narrowed his eyes. "And who conducted those studies? Your company?" A few people chuckled nervously, but the representative's smile didn't falter. "Our engineers are some of the best in the business," he replied smoothly. "You'll just have to trust us." "I don't trust you," Luke shot back. "And I'm not the only one." 2 weeks later, Luke found himself standing outside the county courthouse, clutching a manila folder filled with the paperwork he'd spent countless sleepless nights preparing. He'd scoured every environmental law and local statute he could find, piecing together a case to challenge Green Horizons' water diversion project. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone facade cold and imposing. Luke had never set foot inside before, but he couldn't back down now. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as Luke approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone disinterested. "I'm here to file a motion," Luke said, setting the folder on the counter. The clerk raised an eyebrow, finally looking up. "Are you an attorney?" "No," Luke admitted, "but I've done my research. This motion is solid." The clerk gave a skeptical hum, but accepted the paperwork. A month later, Luke stood in the courtroom, his palms sweating as he waited for the judge to arrive. The room was smaller than he'd imagined, but the weight of what was at stake made it feel massive. When Judge Robert Grayson finally entered, Luke's heart sank. The man radiated authority, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Luke. "You must be Mr. Carter," Judge Grayson said, his voice dripping with skepticism. I've read your motion. It's ambitious. The courtroom chuckled, and Luke's face flushed. This is serious, Your Honor, Luke said, his voice steady despite the jeers. If this project goes through, it'll destroy my farm and this town. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. And you think you're qualified to argue this case? You're a farmer, not a lawyer. The room laughed again, but Luke refused to back down. With respect, Your Honor, he said, meeting the judge's gaze, I know this land. I know this water. And I know what's at stake. If you give me a chance, I'll prove it. The judge leaned back in his chair, regarding Luke with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Very well, he said. But don't waste this court's time, Mr. Carter. As Luke left the courtroom that day, he felt the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on him. The odds were stacked against him. An inexperienced farmer going up against a billion-dollar corporation with a team of high-powered lawyers. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he reminded himself of why he was doing this. This wasn't just about his farm. It was about his family's legacy, his community, and the future of everyone in Maplewood. Clenching his fists, Luke made a silent vow. He would fight with everything he had. No matter what. As Luke left the courtroom that day, he felt the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on him. The odds were stacked against him. An inexperienced farmer going up against a billion-dollar corporation with a team of high-powered lawyers. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he reminded himself of why he was doing this. This wasn't just about his farm. It was about his family's legacy, his community, and the future of everyone in Maplewood. Clenching his fists, Luke made a silent vow. He would fight with everything he had, no matter what. The streets of Maplewood bustled with morning activity as Luke Carter drove his rusted pickup truck through the town square. The old truck rattled over the pothole-ridden roads, a symbol of both Luke's hard work and the town's struggle to stay afloat. Maplewood was a shadow of its former self. Once a thriving farming community, it was now a place where empty storefronts outnumbered open businesses, and people talked more about what they'd lost than what they had. Luke pulled into the parking lot of Gracie's Diner, a small, family-run restaurant where farmers gathered for their morning coffee. As he stepped inside, the clinking of silverware and low murmur of conversation paused. All eyes turned to him. "Morning, Luke," said Gracie, the diner's owner, her voice tinged with sympathy. She knew the uphill battle he was fighting. "Morning," Luke replied with a polite nod as he slid into a booth by the window. A group of older farmers sat at the counter, whispering among themselves. One of them, Earl Jenkins, turned to Luke. "You really think you can take on Green Horizons?" Earl asked, his voice skeptical but not unkind. Luke met his gaze. "Someone has to. They're going to bleed this town dry." "Maybe," Earl said, rubbing his chin. "But they've got lawyers, money, connections. What VE you got?" Luke leaned back in his seat. The truth. And a lot of sleepless nights. The room fell silent again, the weight of Luke's words hanging in the air. As Luke nursed his coffee, his mind drifted back to a different time. When Luke was 18, he'd been offered a scholarship to study agricultural engineering at a university in the city. It had been his dream to learn new techniques that could improve farming in Maplewood. But just before he was set to leave, his father fell ill, and the responsibility of running Carter Acres fell squarely on Luke's shoulders. Over the years, Luke had taught himself everything he could about farming, irrigation, and sustainable agriculture. He'd turned their modest farm into a model of efficiency, finding ways to save water and increase crop yields even during dry seasons. But no matter how much he innovated, the drought had pushed everything to the brink. Luke often wondered what life might have been like if he'd taken that scholarship. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't trade the bond he had with the land or the community he'd grown up in for anything. By the time Luke left Gracie's Diner, the news of his courtroom showdown with Judge Grayson had spread. Small-town gossip moved faster than the wind. "Did you hear?" a woman whispered to her friend outside the grocery store. "Luke Carter thinks he can outsmart Green Horizons." "He's just wasting time," her friend replied. "That company's going to save this town, not him." The divide in the town was becoming more pronounced. On one side were people like Luke, who believed Green Horizons' water diversion project would ruin Maplewood. On the other side were those who saw the corporation as a lifeline, promising jobs and investment in a town that was slowly dying. At the farm supply store, Luke overheard another conversation between two men. "They've got engineers and scientists saying it'll work," one man said, his voice tinged with irritation. "What does Luke have? Some old irrigation system and a hunch?" "Luke's not wrong," the other replied, "but he's got no chance against them lawyers." Luke gritted his teeth and kept walking. He wasn't doing this to be popular. That evening, Luke returned to Carter Acres to find a construction crew from Green Horizons parked just beyond his property line. Their heavy machinery hummed in the distance as they worked on laying pipes for the company's irrigation system. One of the machines was dangerously close to the small stream that bordered Luke's land. "Hey!" Luke shouted, striding toward the workers. "You can't do that. This is private property." A foreman stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We're staying within the boundaries, Mr. Carter. Nothing here is against the law." "Your machines are cutting off the flow to my irrigation line," Luke said, his voice rising. "That water's critical to my crops." The foreman shrugged. "Take it up with the county. We've got permits." Luke's frustration boiled over. He knew the permits were issued by local officials who'd been swayed by Green Horizons' promises of investment. But arguing with the foreman was a waste of time. That night, Luke stayed up late repairing the damaged section of his irrigation system, his hands caked with mud and his back aching. The stars above were brilliant, but Luke couldn't enjoy them. All he could think about was the fight ahead. Over the next several weeks, Luke threw himself into studying environmental laws and local statutes. The dining table in his farmhouse became a makeshift office, covered with law books, engineering schematics, and stacks of handwritten notes. He spent hours poring over maps of the area's water systems, tracing the flow of Willow Creek and calculating how much water Green Horizons project would divert. The numbers were staggering. If the project went forward, Maplewood's farms would dry up within a year. Luke also researched cases where corporations had been stopped by local activists. He learned about legal precedents, environmental impact reports, and the importance of documenting everything. His best friend, Jack Porter, a mechanic who lived nearby, stopped by one evening and raised an eyebrow at the chaos on Luke's table. "You've really gone all in on this, haven't you?" Jack said, leaning against the doorframe. Luke didn't look up from his notes. "If I don't, who will?" Jack sighed. "I admire what you're doing, but you're one guy going up against a machine. What if it doesn't work?" Luke paused, his pen hovering over the page. "Then at least I'll know I tried." Late one night, as Luke combed through a particularly dense legal text, he stumbled upon something that made his heart race. A little-known provision in the state's water usage laws stated that any project diverting water from an existing source had to prove that it would not negatively impact local ecosystems. The burden of proof lay entirely on the entity proposing the project, in this case, Green Horizons. Luke leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He finally had something he could use. The next morning, Luke stood at the edge of his property, staring out at the fields he'd spent his life tending. The land was dry, but his resolve had never been stronger. He had the truth, the evidence, and now, a way to fight back. The town might not believe in him yet, but that didn't matter. This wasn't just about saving his farm. It was about saving everything. As he turned back toward the house, Luke allowed himself a small smile. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance. Luke Carter sat at the defendant's table, his palms resting on the stack of meticulously organized papers in front of him. The courtroom was silent, save for the rustle of papers and the occasional murmurs from the spectators seated in the back rows. Luke's heart thudded in his chest as Judge Robert Grayson entered the room, his robes billowing behind him. Grayson was a tall, stern man with silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to read through people's intentions. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and gazed down at Luke with the faintest hint of a smirk. "So, Mr. Carter," the judge began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you're the farmer who's decided to take on Green Horizons. I've reviewed your filing. It's thorough for someone without a legal degree. But I must warn you, this is a court of law, not the town square. We deal with facts, not feelings." Laughter rippled through the room, particularly from the opposing legal team seated across from Luke. At their center was Edward Vance, Green Horizons' lead attorney, a man with a reputation for tearing apart anyone who dared challenge his clients. His tailored suit and air of smug confidence made him look every bit the part of a corporate shark. Luke felt his cheeks flush, but he straightened his back and met the judge's gaze. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I understand the stakes here, and I'm not here to waste your time. What Green Horizons is planning to do isn't just wrong. It's illegal. And I'm ready to prove it." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Luke's confidence. "Very well. Let's begin." As the proceedings commenced, Vance wasted no time in attempting to dismantle Luke's case. He stood, flashing a polished smile at the judge and jury. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter. Green Horizons has followed every legal protocol required to secure the permits for its irrigation project. The claims made by Mr. Carter are, frankly, baseless and rooted in emotional attachment rather than evidence. While I admire his passion, this case has no merit." Vance turned to face Luke, his smile sharp. "Mr. Carter, do you even understand the legal framework surrounding water rights in this state?" Luke felt the weight of the question, the unspoken implication that he was out of his depth, but he refused to let the pressure show. Rising from his seat, he addressed the courtroom with calm determination. "I may not have a law degree, Mr. Vance, but I've spent months studying every law, statute, and case related to water rights in this state. And I can assure you, I understand them well enough to know that your project violates them." Vance's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see about that," he said, retaking his seat. Luke began presenting his argument, starting with the environmental impact of Green Horizons project. He laid out detailed maps of the area, pointing to how diverting water from Willow Creek would leave the surrounding farmland dry and destroy the delicate ecosystems that depended on it. He cited studies and reports that he had painstakingly gathered, some of which he had compiled himself using data from years of observing the land. "Willow Creek isn't just a water source," Luke explained, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "It's the lifeblood of this community. Without it, the farms that have sustained Maplewood for generations will die, and so will the town." As Luke spoke, he noticed a shift in the room. The spectators who had come expecting a train wreck were now leaning forward, their attention fully on him. Even Judge Grayson, who had been dismissive at the start, seemed to be listening more closely. But just as Luke began to feel a glimmer of hope, Vance struck back. Rising from his seat, the lawyer strode to the center of the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. "Your Honor," Vance began, his tone smooth and practiced, "while Mr. Carter's presentation is compelling, it's also incomplete. He fails to mention that Green Horizons has conducted extensive studies to ensure that our project will not harm the environment or the community. In fact," he turned to the clerk, who handed him a document, "we have here a report from an independent environmental consulting firm that confirms our project is both sustainable and beneficial to the region." Vance handed the document to Judge Grayson, who began skimming its contents. The courtroom murmured as the supposed independent report was passed around. Luke's stomach sank. He had seen this tactic before, corporations hiring consultants to produce favorable reports that glossed over the truth. He stood quickly. "Your Honor, I request that we subpoena the records of this consulting firm. I believe their findings may not be as independent as Mr. Vance claims." The judge looked up from the report, his expression unreadable. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. Do you have any evidence to support it?" Luke hesitated. He didn't have concrete evidence yet, but his instincts told him he was right. "Not yet, Your Honor," he admitted, "but I believe their records will reveal a conflict of interest." Vance seized the opportunity to pounce. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I meant earlier. Mr. Carter is relying on speculation and conspiracy theories, not facts. He's wasting this court's time." Grayson held up a hand to silence Vance. After a long pause, he turned to Luke. "I'll allow the subpoena, but only because I'm curious to see where this goes. Mr. Carter, you've taken on a heavy burden. You'd better be prepared to carry it." Luke nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the hearing adjourned for the day, Luke left the courtroom feeling both relieved and overwhelmed. The subpoena was a small victory, But the road ahead was still daunting. He knew Green Horizons wouldn't go down without a fight, and their lawyers would do everything in their power to discredit him. Outside the courthouse, a handful of reporters had gathered, eager for a soundbite from the underdog farmer who had dared to take on a corporate giant. Luke kept his head down, refusing to comment as he made his way to his truck. He didn't care about the headlines or the attention. All that mattered was the fight itself. As he drove back to Carter Acres, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the dry fields. The sight filled Luke with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't doing this for fame or glory. He was doing it for the land, for the town, and for the generations that had come before him. He knew the odds were against him, but he also knew that the truth was on his side. And sometimes he thought that was enough. For now, it had to be. Luke Carter stood in his barn, surrounded by blueprints, soil samples, and a makeshift model of the town's water system he had constructed using pipes, buckets, and old irrigation parts. The barn had become his war room, a place where he could think, plan, and strategize. After weeks of digging through Green Horizons documents, analyzing every detail, Luke had finally pieced together the scale of the corporation's deceit. The subpoenaed documents revealed a troubling truth. The independent environmental study Green Horizons had relied on was anything but independent. Payments from the company to the consulting firm were disguised as grants, and emails between executives showed clear instructions to manipulate the data to downplay the impact on the town's water supply. Luke knew this was his moment. He had the evidence to discredit Green Horizons, but that wasn't enough. He needed a solution, something that didn't just stop the project but proved that sustainable farming and smart resource management could save the town. That night, as the crickets chirped outside the barn, Luke stayed up late, poring over his notes and models. He thought back to his years on the farm, all the times he had solved small problems with ingenuity and grit. What if he could scale that thinking to solve the town's water crisis? His idea had started as a flicker during his research. Willow Creek's water wasn't the problem. It was how it was being used. Most of the water was lost to inefficient irrigation systems and outdated farming methods. What if he could design a system that conserved water, recycled runoff, and prioritized efficiency? It was ambitious, almost impossible, but Luke's mind was sharp and his hands were steady. By dawn, he had sketched out a plan. It involved retrofitting existing irrigation systems with precision drip lines, building reservoirs to capture rainwater and runoff, and installing low-tech filters to clean water for reuse. His calculations showed that the system could cut water usage by nearly 40% while maintaining crop yields. It was a gamble, but it was one worth taking. 2 days later, Luke stood in the courtroom, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. The air was tense as Judge Grayson entered, taking his seat at the bench. On the other side of the room, Edward Vance looked as polished and confident as ever, flanked by Green Horizons executives. "Mr. Carter," Judge Grayson began, peering down at him, "I hope you're ready. I'll remind you that the burden of proof lies with you. This court needs hard evidence, not theories." Luke nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." Vance wasted no time in attacking. Rising from his chair, he launched into a smooth, rehearsed argument. "Your Honor, Green Horizons has complied with every regulation. The project has been thoroughly vetted, and any claims to the contrary are baseless. This is a corporation acting in good faith to bring economic growth to the region." Luke stood, his palms damp but his resolve steady. "Your Honor, I have evidence that Green Horizons' environmental study was falsified. The consulting firm that conducted it was paid to manipulate the data to favor the project. I've submitted emails and financial records to prove it." The courtroom murmured as Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Vance, do you have a response to these allegations?" Vance's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Your Honor, we've reviewed those documents, and they're being taken out of context. The payments were for legitimate consulting services, nothing more." Luke took a deep breath. "If that's true, then let's bring in the consultants for questioning. Let's see if their story matches yours." The judge nodded. "That's a reasonable request. I'll issue an order for their testimony. But, Mr. Carter, that doesn't solve the larger issue. Even if Green Horizons' study is flawed, This court needs an alternative plan if we're going to halt a project of this scale. Do you have one? Luke stepped forward, clutching the rolled-up blueprints he'd brought with him. Yes, Your Honor. I've designed a water conservation system that could save this town and eliminate the need for Green Horizons to divert water from Willow Creek. It's sustainable, affordable, and uses existing resources. The courtroom fell silent as Luke unrolled the blueprints on the table and began explaining his plan. He used simple language, breaking down the mechanics of the system so everyone could understand. It's about efficiency, Luke said, pointing to the diagrams. Farmers waste a lot of water because we don't have access to modern systems. This plan changes that. We capture rainwater and runoff, reuse what we can, and focus on delivering water directly to the roots of crops instead of spraying it into the air where it evaporates. He paused, looking directly at the judge. This isn't just theory, Your Honor. I've tested these methods on my own farm, and they work. I've cut my water usage by 1/3 without sacrificing yields. Judge Grayson leaned forward, studying the blueprints with interest. And you're saying this could be implemented townwide? With enough support, yes, Luke replied. It's not just about stopping Green Horizons. It's about proving that we don't need them to save our town. We can do it ourselves. Vance rose from his seat, his face taut with barely concealed irritation. Your Honor, while I commend Mr. Carter's creativity, this is not an engineering competition. This is a courtroom. We're here to debate the legality of Green Horizons project, not entertain hypothetical solutions. Luke turned to face him, his voice calm but firm. It's not hypothetical. It's practical. The only reason Green Horizons project seems necessary is because they've convinced everyone that there's no alternative. But there is. The judge held up a hand to stop the exchange. That's enough. Mr. Carter, I'll admit, your presentation is compelling. But we need more than blueprints and calculations. If you want this court to take your plan seriously, you'll need to provide detailed projections, cost estimates, and evidence of feasibility. Luke nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, Your Honor. Grayson's gaze lingered on Luke for a moment before he spoke again. Very well. You have 1 week to provide the court with the necessary documentation. If you can prove your plan is viable, this court will consider it as an alternative to Green Horizons project. That night, Luke returned to his barn, exhausted but determined. He had 1 week to prove that his plan could work, not just for his farm, but for the entire town. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time, he felt like the tide was starting to turn. As he sat at his workbench, sketching out calculations and compiling data, he thought about his father's words. The land gives back what you put into it. Treat it right, and it'll treat you right. Luke smiled to himself, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for the land. He was fighting for the people who depended on it. And he wasn't going to stop until he won. The courtroom was packed. The case had become the talk of the town, and word of Luke Carter's bold challenge to Green Horizons had spread like wildfire. Reporters lined the back wall, scribbling notes or whispering updates into their phones. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone awaited the continuation of the trial. For Luke, this was the moment of truth. He had spent the last week working tirelessly to prepare his evidence, running on little more than determination and coffee. Judge Robert Grayson entered the room and took his seat. His stern gaze swept over the courtroom before landing on Luke. Mr. Carter, are you prepared to proceed? Yes, Your Honor, Luke said, standing. His voice was steady, but his heart raced. This wasn't just about proving himself. It was about saving the town. Grayson gestured for him to continue, and Luke moved to the center of the room, his blueprints, charts, and research notes laid out on a table. He began by recapping his water conservation plan, pointing to detailed cost breakdowns and feasibility studies he had compiled. He explained how the system would reduce water usage, increase efficiency, and preserve Willow Creek for future generations. This isn't just a theory, Luke said, his voice growing stronger. I've already implemented parts of this system on my farm. My yields are up, my costs are down, and I'm using a fraction of the water. If we scale this plan to the entire town, we can achieve the same results, without needing to divert a single drop of water from Willow Creek. Judge Grayson leaned forward, studying the charts Luke had placed in front of him. These numbers are impressive, Mr. Carter. But this is a courtroom, not a boardroom. You need to show how this relates to the legality of Green Horizons project. Luke nodded. Your Honor, the basis of my argument is that Green Horizons has not met their legal obligation to prove that their project won't harm the environment or the community. My plan demonstrates that there's a viable alternative, which means their project isn't just unnecessary, it's reckless. Edward Vance, Green Horizons' lead attorney, rose from his seat, his expression sharp. Your Honor, this is nothing more than an elaborate distraction. Mr. Carter is not an engineer, nor is he an environmental expert. He's a farmer. While his passion is admirable, his plan lacks the credibility to be considered a serious alternative. Luke turned to face Vance, meeting his gaze. You're right about one thing. I'm not an engineer, but I know this land better than anyone in this room, and I know what works. Your so-called experts have ignored the reality of what their project will do to this community. My plan is grounded in that reality. Vance smirked. Reality? Let's talk about reality, Mr. Carter. Green Horizons has the resources, the expertise, and the backing of independent studies to prove that our project is both legal and beneficial. What do you have? A few charts and a dream? Luke's jaw tightened. I have the truth, and I have evidence that your so-called independent study was falsified. The room erupted in murmurs, and Judge Grayson banged his gavel. Order. Mr. Carter, you've made this accusation before. Do you have new evidence to support it? Luke took a deep breath. Yes, Your Honor. Over the past week, I've worked with an environmental analyst to review Green Horizons' study. We found discrepancies in their data that directly contradict their claims. I've also obtained testimony from a whistleblower who worked for the consulting firm hired by Green Horizons. This individual can confirm that the study was manipulated to favor the project. Vance's confident demeanor faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Mr. Carter is relying on hearsay and unverified allegations. Judge Grayson raised a hand to silence him. I'll allow the whistleblower to testify. Bring them in. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit stepped inside, clutching a folder of documents. He looked nervous as he approached the witness stand, avoiding eye contact with Vance. State your name for the record, the judge instructed. My name is William Tate, the man said, his voice shaking slightly. I was a senior analyst at Clearwater Consulting, the firm hired by Green Horizons to conduct their environmental study. And what do you wish to testify to, Mr. Tate? Judge Grayson asked. Tate took a deep breath. I want to tell the truth. Green Horizons pressured us to alter our findings. They paid us to make the data look like their project wouldn't harm Willow Creek, but the original report showed significant environmental risks. When I tried to push back, they threatened my job. The courtroom erupted again, and the judge banged his gavel. Order. Mr. Tate, do you have any evidence to support these claims? Yes, Your Honor, Tate said, holding up the folder. I have emails, internal memos, and early drafts of the report that show the discrepancies. The judge motioned for the bailiff to collect the folder. As the documents were passed to him, Judge Grayson's expression grew darker with every page he read. Finally, he looked up, his gaze fixed on Vance. Mr. Vance, the judge said, his voice cold. Do you have an explanation for this? Vance stammered, clearly caught off guard. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of these actions. If there was any wrongdoing, it was the fault of the consulting firm, not Green Horizons. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We'll see about that. In the meantime, Mr. Carter, do you have anything further to add? Luke stood, his confidence bolstered by Tate's testimony. Just this, Your Honor. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how much effort is put into covering it up. This isn't just about my farm or Green Horizons. It's about doing what's right for this town. The judge nodded. Thank you, Mr. Carter. This court will recess for the day while I review the new evidence. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. As the courtroom emptied, Luke felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Green Horizons wouldn't back down easily, and there was still a long way to go before victory was assured. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters had gathered, cheering for Luke as he walked to his truck. He smiled and waved, grateful for their encouragement. But as he drove back to Carter Acres, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was about to get even more intense. In his rearview mirror, he spotted a sleek black car following him at a distance. His grip tightened on the wheel. Whatever Green Horizons had planned next, Luke knew he needed to stay vigilant. The fight for Maplewood was far from over. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised and cameras ready to capture every moment. Residents of Maplewood had packed the gallery, their expressions a mix of hope and tension. Luke Carter stood at the defendant's table, his back straight and his head high. He had spent the last night reviewing every piece of evidence, every argument, and every fact that could make or break this case. This was the day that would decide the future of his town and his farm. Judge Robert Grayson entered the room and sat at the bench, his usual stern expression even more severe. He shuffled through the stack of documents in front of him. Luke's detailed plans, the whistleblower's testimony, and the damning evidence of Green Horizons' corruption. The room fell silent as he adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "This has been a complex case," Judge Grayson began, his deep voice carrying through the courtroom. "We've heard compelling arguments from both sides, and the evidence presented raises significant questions about the integrity of Green Horizons project and its potential impact on this community." Luke held his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He glanced at Edward Vance, who sat across the room with a tight, forced smile. The Green Horizons lawyer looked confident on the surface, but Luke had seen the cracks in his facade over the last few days. Vance had underestimated him, and now the corporation's carefully crafted image was unraveling. "Mr. Carter," Grayson continued, turning his attention to Luke, "you've presented a detailed alternative to the Green Horizons project, one that prioritizes conservation and sustainability. Your initiative demonstrates creativity, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of this town's needs. However, this court must determine whether your evidence is sufficient to halt a legally approved project." Luke nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Grayson shifted his gaze to Edward Vance. "Mr. Vance, you and your client have claimed that the Green Horizons project complies with all regulations. However, the evidence provided by Mr. Carter and corroborated by Mr. Tate suggests otherwise. The manipulated environmental study alone is a grave violation of the law." Vance stood, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the seriousness of these allegations, they do not negate the legality of the permits granted to my client. Green Horizons acted in good faith, relying on third-party experts." Grayson's expression hardened. "Good faith does not absolve your client of accountability, Mr. Vance. This court will not ignore evidence of fraudulent practices." He turned back to Luke. "Mr. Carter, do you have any final remarks before I issue my ruling?" Luke stood, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about water or permits. It's about the people of Maplewood. Green Horizons saw this town as an easy target, a place where they could take what they wanted without caring about the consequences. But this town is stronger than they realize. We don't need their promises of jobs or progress. What we need is a fair chance to build our future on our own terms." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This plan I've presented isn't just an alternative. It's a blueprint for survival. For years, we've been told that small towns like ours can't compete, that we have to sacrifice our way of life to stay afloat. I'm here to prove that's not true." The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Luke. Even Judge Grayson seemed moved by his sincerity. The judge took a long, measured breath before speaking. "This court finds that Green Horizons project, as it currently stands, violates state environmental laws and poses an unacceptable risk to the community. Effective immediately, all work on the project is to cease, and an independent investigation will be launched into Green Horizons practices." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief and excitement. Judge Grayson raised his gavel, silencing the noise. "Furthermore, this court recognizes the validity of Mr. Carter's proposed water conservation plan. While this ruling does not mandate its implementation, I strongly encourage the town council to consider it as a viable path forward." He banged his gavel. This case is adjourned." The room erupted into applause. Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders sagging with relief. He turned to see his best friend Jack and a group of supportive townsfolk standing and cheering. Even Gracie from the diner was there, wiping tears from her eyes. As Luke gathered his papers, Edward Vance stormed past him, muttering something under his breath. Luke didn't care. He had one.